hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, good stuff. So let's start off with learning outcome 7. And in this, we are looking at the minimum core of planning and delivery, which tends to be making the teaching and learning inclusive. Basically, what this means is that what we are looking at when we start our sessions, um, we are looking at demonstrating a minimum set of let's say a minimum set of ground rules. Let's say if we lay down a minimum set of ground rules, which would allow me as a teacher to essentially demonstrate that I have one of these 4 core skills that we're going to look at in the assessment criteria. And these tend to be, that I'm able to, when I'm able to teach and deliver any content, I have command over literacy, I have command over language, and I have command over numeracy. So these are basic elements that are required when we as teachers, tutors, instructors, trainers, look at delivering any particular session or any particular, key topic within the educational setup. Now, these are required because they tend to be identified as what are called the core or 4 minimum core skills which teachers need to have. And that is why sometimes when you look at, applying for the when you do apply for the qualified teacher status, they will ask for in addition, obviously in accordance with the rules and regulations, but in addition to your teaching qualification, they'll ask you for your numeracy and literacy. Now, literacy tends to be making sure that you are able to read, write, and assess. When we look at assessment of work from a teacher's perspective, so you're able to look at grammar, punctuation, syntax, learner's work, and your own work, and obviously make sure that the work being submitted is meeting some sort of academic standards. Language tends to be speaking and listening, so that whenever you are communicating in the class or in a session or in a training, you are communicating and speaking in such a way that the opposite side, which is the learners, are able to clearly understand and acknowledge what is being taught. And numeracy tends to be carrying out, some bits of calculations, interpretation. Sometimes they could be evaluations or, measurements, depending on what, you're teaching. So the minimum core standards that we look at, which are defined by the, Department for Education, and specifically within the school and the FE setup, they tend to be, looking at key set of policies and ensuring that this is the minimum requirement which a teacher meets before they can be actually allowed to teach in a particular setup. And they tend to include, when we looked at, in learning outcome 5, when we looked at some of the policies like equality, diversity, discrimination, and when we looked at in the previous learning outcome inclusive teaching and learning in learning outcome 5, that is where we need to be looking at ensuring that when we teach and when a teacher teaches and delivers, they are following this minimum, core, and that minimum core tends to be, the minimum set of standards defined by the Department for Education. And in this case, that minimum core tends to be ensuring that you have where you have good knowledge about the basic policies which need to be implemented, observed, and you should be aware of in terms of knowledge when you are in a classroom-based setting or when you are in a teaching setup. So equality, diversity, inclusion, and then the core principles which apply, wherein you are able to then apply this to any such program that you teach, so that you're able to give coverage. You're able to essentially cater to all the learners, from a point of view of, getting them included in your sessions. And that tends to be the, minimum core, as it is called. I think there's a bit of a background which I'm aware of. When I did my teacher training, that core was essentially created way back in 2004. And, most of the Learning Sector Skill Council, what they did was they wanted to standardize the teacher side of trainings across different sectors. So we had, say, for example, the primary, secondary, the sixth form, the FE, and also the HE. So what the Department for Education did at that point in time was came across with a minimum set of core principles and a policy which stipulated that awarding bodies need to follow this minimum core to ensure that the teacher training, when it is delivered or it is done, it meets and conforms to these particular standards. Now, there is a revised document which is, over the years, obviously the first version came out in 2004, but the revised document of it is also available on the Education and Training Foundation ETF website. And that minimum core focuses on the elements of English, maths, digital skills, and obviously the EDI, which is equality, diversity, and inclusion, as we call it. Now, in the recent years, sustainability has also been added as one of the cores that when we teach and deliver, teachers who do not have these skills and knowledge themselves will have difficulty in supporting learners or learners with your needs, wherein they need to develop them into these important subject areas. So that is where this particular core within each subject area is then divided into, the core of planning, delivery, and assessing. So sometimes you would see that we are able to teach as teachers, but obviously we also at some point in time need to do a assessing qualification. And that tends to come across, from this minimum core. So we'll be looking at planning to teach. We'll be looking at approaches to teaching. There could be additional resources and support required to help develop employability skills in the HE and the FE sector in particular. So this core can be applied across various, what I'm trying to say is can be applied across, various sectors, which is what the Department for Education, provided. But when we look at the main part of it in terms of how this helps in planning, delivering, and assessing is what we need to look at in the Learning Outcomes 7. Now, there are bits and pieces of it which will include, obviously, sometimes when you look at, depending on the sector that we go into, you would probably see that some of these would have a differentiated aspect of how, they would be implemented within that part of the, teaching environment or say, for example, that setup. So whether it's schools, FE or HE, you will need to adapt this minimum core of planning, teaching, and assessing to make sure that your teaching is inclusive. And when we look at this teaching being inclusive, that would mean that you're conforming to the standards which have been specified by the Department for Education, and they follow the minimum core for teacher training qualification. Now, the main crux of it that we need to remember in Learning Outcome 7 is that when we talk about this particular core, this core consists of elements of English, maths, digital skills, and EDI, which is equality, diversity, and inclusion. And that is where the two parts of this in terms of assessment criteria will be used to, discuss the majority of the learning outcome. So let me just switch over to the presentation, and then we'll discuss some of the slides that we've got. So as I mentioned to you, this particular core part of it is required now to teach within classrooms, and it is considered as an essential element or essential toolkit for any particular teacher in any sort of a setup, as long as you are involved in some sort of teaching, learning, and delivery. So they tend to be good command of English, which helps you, obviously have good communication with yourself, your learners and yourself. It needs to be literacy, and obviously some parts of those components when broken down into, reading, writing, grammar, punctuation, speaking and listening constitute, English. Mathematics, obviously, wherein we are looking at numeracy, literacy, numeracy in particular, but calculations, evaluations, interpretations that sometimes can be recognized with relation to, problem solving and cognitive skills. And then digital skills have become quite important in today's world simply because we're using a lot of technological aids to be able to teach and deliver. And that is why digital skills are also have also become an essential part of this core. And then the original part or the original aspect of that teaching includes, when we teach, we make sure that we are looking at following the principles of equality, diversity, cultural understanding, and obviously inclusion is the bit which, forms this minimum core. Now, when we look at the separate elements of three separate elements, and we look at planning, delivering, and assessing, that is what we need to relate to, is what part of it is related to literacy, numeracy, digital skills, or, EDI. So when we look at these bits, they are probably a part of the core vision or the, the main document on the basis of which an educational setup is normally done. So what is the way in which teaching and learning would happen within an institution, and they tend to be, forming or giving some, let's say, they will essentially provide some inputs into, how the setup would actually look at, let's say, you look at making, let me rephrase. So how a setup would essentially ensure that there is learning happening to a certain level within that setup, with, say, for example, a school. So sometimes you might ask a question that, okay, explain how learners, background can impact development of English skills. Now, this would be related to a minimum core standard, which is literacy as a standard. And when we plan and when we teach, what we are looking at is we are looking at researching into the background of and knowing about the background about the individual learner, the cultural, background where they come from. Even look at some of the linguistic factors that may enhance or inhibit, the development of English skills as far as the learner is concerned or the child is concerned. And what has happened is that this minimum core has then been detailed out into a table, which then can be used to classify and go into detail of what is planning. So there could be a number of questions and a number of standards which have been defined in that core. These standards tend to be, when we look at planning for teaching, they tend to be standards A. When we look at approaches to teaching, they tend to be standards B, B1 to B8. And when we talk about, supporting learners for various other aspects, like if I look at higher education, you would normally see the DiET program review, which tends to happen every 3 years, every 5 years with the awarding body. They look at getting feedback from employers. And the idea of having that feedback from employers is to also have an input into what would be the basic requirements of the employability for employability within the sector. And that is what the curriculum also has to include. So those standards are classed from C1 to C3. Then we have industry-specific teaching and standards to meet in the minimum core. Those are classified as D. And then we have assessment. So after planning, after teaching, we go into assessment. Assessment would also include feedback, because obviously learners are keen to understand what grades they've got, whether they passed, not passed, what scores they've got in any sort of subject area that they are being assessed on. And those standards are referred to as the minimum core standards for assessment, and they are labeled as standards E. And when we talk about EDI in particular, we are looking at standards which are standards, F, G, and, predominantly F and G. They would include standards which are equality, diversity, and inclusion. Now, the bits that I am mentioning right now is available as a handout, which I will provide, and they would be something that you can go through. It's a document which was prepared by DFE, and it defines the minimum core standards for, teacher training, and obviously from a planning, delivery, and assessing point of view. Now, on the slides, I've created about, a couple of slides just to give a bit of a background that where these key standards, which is numeracy, literacy, digital skills, and EDI, fall into place, and what are these standards which, what are the bits which are covered within these standards. So when we look at ICT, in particular technology, there could be various digital tools and platforms which are used now for delivery and communication. They tend to be either you're using a software, you're using some sort of an equipment, and they would essentially be useful as visual aids, or in some cases, providing visual experiences to learners within the classroom. Now, we talk about delivery, and again, we relate this to the delivery of, delivery standards to the minimum core. And when we do talk about the delivery, what we are looking at is including, the various parts of it which are going to help us. This toolkit that we have as a very basic toolkit, this toolkit would be helping us to, effectively deliver in the class. That means whatever we are teaching is conforming to some standards. That is where you are going back to standards in terms of schema works and lesson plan. You're following a particular curriculum. Then on the basis of that, you're creating, curriculum, then a schema work and a lesson plan, and on the basis of which you're essentially creating activities or, discussion points, which are going to drill down further into the key concepts. And they would then be looking at helping learners understand what is required to be read at a particular level. And in such cases, that would inform that if you're falling through this particular route of delivery, then that would inform the managers or people who are reviewing the curriculum and programs at the end of 1 year, 3 year, 5 year period, would inform that the delivery is having an effect in terms of the results and the objectives which have been set, and those are being delivered by teachers who are actually teaching this in the classroom. And same part of it can be applied to assessing. So various components in terms of how they can be applied to planning, delivery, and assessment are basically what are covered in the overarching understanding of the learning outcome, which is to say, how do we implement expectations of the minimum core for planning, delivering, and assessing to ensure that it benefits children, learners, students, depending on the setup in which we are. Now, you'd be able to go and look into this particular document, which basically talks about, the minimum core of it. And that's what is a document which is available on the Education and Training Foundation website. I will show that to you briefly just to relate to it. And these bit would be the ones that you need to maybe go through and understand for additional reading. So this is the minimum core, which is defined, in further education and, obviously in sector skills specifically for, teachers. And this particular document consists of, the minimum core for planning, minimum core for teaching, and then minimum core for supporting learners or, looking at delivery. And these tables essentially give you some guidance in terms of what is something like key descriptors when we look at qualifications at different level. Similarly, these are like key standards of descriptors, specifically when we relate to the aspect of the minimum toolkit which the teachers need to be equipped with or qualified with to be able to teach within a classroom-based setting. And these are examples. These are tables which are basically, given each relating to the individual area. And what you could do is primarily pick it up, go through it, just read it, and obviously then apply it to the field in which you are essentially going to relate it to. Say, for example, in your case, learners with special needs, and that could be something that you can apply when we go into some of the assessment criteria, because what it will ask you to do in one of the assessment criteria is primarily apply these minimum core standards to show how you are able to plan, deliver, and assess, and to meet the standards, and also ensure that your teaching and learning is being done in an environment which is inclusive. So knowing the standards would be important. And if you know the standards and what are these standards which are required to be met, you'd be able to then, provide an example, because it says apply. And that is what this table will be useful for when you look at, fulfilling one of the assessment criteria. Now, you might not want to take out all of it, but maybe the idea would be to summarize, planning, delivering, and assessing, and digital skills and EDI in 2 or 3 different types of tables to show how this is being applied by picking up one particular standard. So you might not want to pick out, for example, if I look at core digital skills, you might just pick out one standard and then apply it and show that this is what is being applied, because you might not use all the standards which have been given in delivering one lesson within a particular class, or one lesson or as a session in the term. You might be applying just the one standard in a couple of sessions, another standard in another session, and another standard or maybe a couple of other standards in subsequent sessions or classes. But the idea would be to look at picking up one and then applying it to a situation wherein how you're teaching and delivering in a class and how this standard is related to the minimum core, which is specified, as a basic expectation for you to be able to plan, teach, and deliver within a classroom. So I'll make this handout available so that you have it to be able to see it and obviously use it for the purposes of discussing some of the assessment criteria. Is that okay?
Yeah, that would be really helpful.
Okay, now the first part of the assessment criteria says, analyze ways in which minimum core elements can be demonstrated in delivering, teaching, learning, and assessing inclusively within a particular setup. Now here, it tends to be a bit repetitive in the sense that how do we So what we have to do in this case is we have to demonstrate how do we use these core elements in preparing a classroom which is inclusive in terms of our delivery when we do. And how do we embed these core elements into our teaching style? So if I look at the minimum core elements, I wouldn't want to be repetitive in terms of talking about, English or maths or digital skills or EDI. What I want to do and discuss in this particular task is that, okay, how do I embed these minimum core elements as a teacher in my teaching style or in my teaching, and then adapt and then firm it up or maybe adapt it to a particular teaching style that is very unique to me. So when we look at this minimum guidance, what we want to be able to do is talk about in terms of how do we look at incorporating this by looking at these standards, and how do we incorporate this in our own teaching and delivery that we do on a day in, day out basis, for a particular subject area. And when we talk about this, I would basically look at going back to the basic minimum, preparation that I would do, in which what I would do is primarily look at including, the basic elements of, say, if I look at say, for example, if I'm teaching strategic HRM, some part of it involves discussing, the key theoretical models of why strategic planning is required in human resources department. So when I talk about that aspect of it, if I need to include that into the aspect of a particular session when I'm teaching, I might use, say, for example, I might take aid of some equipment, which could be a projector and PowerPoint slides. And that is where I'm seen to be embedding and using my digital skills to bring that topic or discuss that topic in the classroom. Now, what I discuss in the core of the topic, obviously, is the subject matter, the theoretical framework, but how I am embedding the minimum core of digital skills into while delivering my sessions is making sure that I have adequate resources to be able to use while I'm delivering that session. In my planning, I would include that, okay, in this presentation or in this discussion on the class, say, for example, on Monday, I'm going to discuss the strategic human resources model. These models will be discussed with the help of some videos and some PowerPoint slides. So my planning side of things informs me that I would need suitable equipment and obviously videos, which would need maybe some sort of a sound output, speakers to be able to, display and play them in the class. So part of it is inclusion of the digital core skills. Then the second part would be to look at also talking about, the relevance of these models in today's context. So when I do talk about relevance of these models in today's context, I might look at bringing in some of the evaluative components of how human resources planning can be done. And when I relate this to numbers, to say if it's a small business, micro business, small business, or a large setup like a HE setup, you'd have probably, or not an HE setup, but a business here in this case, would have, say, hundreds and hundreds of employees. By taking an example of, say, Tesco's as an organization, I might say, okay, that has over 140,000 employees. So in such cases, when we look at working within Tesco's, the human resources department would need to look at a number of parameters to do planning on the resources side, and that would involve numbers. That means how many numbers are required per store, how many numbers are required per region, how many managers would you have over the number of employees working in a particular area, and that would involve some part of mathematics or numeracy part of it in my part of the delivery of lesson. And then the most important bit, which will be paramount, will be, say, for example, the communication part, which will be related to literacy in terms of being able to engage with the learners, being able to communicate clearly by asking the right questions or talking about open-ended questions, which would allow learners to be able to participate. And as a teacher, it would become necessary for me to, work on developing this continuously in order to engage with the learners and in order to test the skills and obviously help them build knowledge around this subject area. And that is where I would be looking at taking into play, let's say, taking into account the aspect of some aspects of numeracy, literacy, use of digital skills, and obviously ensuring that any examples that I pick out or any specific case studies or areas of discussion that I do are basically not examples or areas which are picked out which single out a particular cultural background or type of students. And that is where I'm looking at making sure that I'm following equality, diversity, and understanding of cultural nuances of different types of learners in the class and their needs to be able to teach effectively. And that would be a part of my overall planning to ensure that the lesson that I'm preparing is very clearly meeting the minimum core elements and have those minimum core elements in terms of my preparation. And then when I teach and deliver, I can demonstrate that my planning and delivery has been inclusive, and I have ensured that I've taken relevant resources that allow me to put that topic across in front of my learners, which is fit for purpose, and obviously it is effective in terms of delivering the learning which is required when I do the planning for that particular session. So bits and pieces that you would need to put across in this would be to use a particular example that you do and how you plan a session or do it in the class, but show how the elements of minimum core are actually being incorporated when you're actually delivering this session to a number of learners or different types of learners within the class. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So there's not really much that we need to focus on, but you need to look at a practical example of how you have planned a particular class or a session. And with that in mind, you would show how the elements of the minimum course elements that we talk about are incorporated into your planning, delivery, and obviously at some stage assessing. So as long as you're able to demonstrate that with a bit of a practical example, that would help you meet this particular task or the assessment criteria. Another example, if I have to give, primarily to show that how would this be, let's say, used, for example, in creating inclusive classroom strategies, then what I would do is, just like when we start our sessions, sometimes on Zoom, what we do is we describe certain basic housekeeping tips. Say, for example, keep your microphone muted so that the recordings come out clear. If you have to ask me a question, raise your hand, or you can ask me through the chat route. And then one of the things which we normally recommend to learners is that keep giving us feedback that you're able to see the slides and you're able to hear us clearly. Now, these could be various examples, or a small example, I would put it this way, of various inclusive teaching strategies that, sometimes we as instructors, lecturers, teachers put into place. So what I do with the housekeeping tips is define a minimum clear standard that is required in terms of their behavior when they are attending the sessions with me. Now, sometimes I have to enforce these standards consistently, because if people forget to mute their microphone, I end up going and muting the microphone, which would mean that I have to look at, once I've defined these standards, I have to look at enforcing these standards as well. And sometimes what I also need to do is obviously look at asking open-ended questions, or sometimes when we do these icebreaker sessions in terms of doing activities or quizzes, is basically creating opportunities for my learners, or depending on the setup, again, children, students, learners, to become more participative in the class. And then the technique of scaffolding that we use as teachers, the approach of scaffolding is very important as far as the teaching side of things are concerned, because what we try to do with the scaffolding technique is primarily looking at, I would say, structuring things across in a way wherein it follows the teacher. As a teacher, what I'm doing is I'm basically looking at some sort of an instructional practice which allows me to gradually move and provide guidance to learners to be able to support them in their learning. And what I would do is basically look at bite-size delivery in terms of ensuring that they understand this concept, then with this concept, and they go on to understand the next step and then the next step. And that helps to, let's say, systemize the learning side of things when there is a complex topics being discussed, or, for example, something which is to do with also looking at bringing into prior knowledge and experience of learners, looking at setting goals, and obviously ensuring that my instructions that I'm giving out are using skills and strategies which are primarily going to be important for the learners to understand the concepts. And they are related to, obviously, at the end of the day, as a teacher, what I would do is related to to the lesson plan. And then over a point in time, what I would want to do is let the student run it with it independently by looking at thinking of examples or similar situations in which they can apply, and that would allow them to continuously build onto the knowledge which I'm giving. Say, for example, in this case for strategic management, there are 6 or 7 different models that we talk about, but we generally, as a lecturer in my class, what I would do is normally talk about 2 or 3 main models, and then ask learners to go and do their own research to discuss and find out about the other models which are now also widely accepted. And then the next session, before we start discussing a newer topic, what we do is do a bit of a recap to see if they have gone in and done their research, brought that homework back, and is there a relevant point to be able to discuss and apply so that it makes the learning complete. So this bit in terms of the scaffolding becomes quite important, and that could be one of the things that you could show or talk about when we look at the application of minimum core elements to demonstrate teaching, learning, and assessing in a classroom. Is that okay?
Yep. All good.
Now, the second one, first one was to analyze the part theoretically. The second assessment criteria now says apply. So where is, again, here, when we look at the application part of it, you have to look at putting in a practical example of how you're embedding the minimum core elements in your teaching and delivery on a daily basis with your learners. So this bit needs to look at a particular example in terms of how would you organize the minimum core. So I would probably end up doing a table, and that table would have numeracy, literacy, digital skills, and EDI, and then I would put a topic across, which is what I will basically say, okay, if I'm discussing this particular topic, for example, if I were to do just, out of the blue, if I was to do the 7 P's of marketing, which would be price, product, place, physical evidence, people, and, packaging, then at some stage, what I would need to do is apply how this bit of teaching and learning of the marketing mix, as I call it, that I'm discussing with learners would need to apply in the case of planning, delivering, assessing, as far as this is concerned. So from a class perspective, when I look at this aspect of applying, there could be various examples that you could look at picking up. And one of the examples that I would say that I can think of in terms of how I would pick this up would be, say, for example, if I look at my lesson plan of, say, teaching, say, for example, something like, sports example. If I was teaching sports management, then one of the learning objectives, for example, in one of the units could be, or if I look at teaching in this case, when I look at lesson planning, which is one of the modules in teaching in level 6, this module of lesson planning would be broken down into various learning outcomes. So if I'm looking at covering learning outcome 1, and some of the assessment criteria in the first one or two sessions in the class, and they typically talk about understanding the difference between what is a scheme of work and what is a lesson plan, and then understand what are the very basics that you would require to put together an effective lesson plan in place to be able to teach. And then at some stage, it talks about, how is this learning outcome reference to the overall criteria in terms of what you're teaching as a curriculum, which is the unit lesson planning. So I might say, okay, this relates to this particular assessment criteria, and this relates to this assessment criteria. So I might say, okay, this is 1.1, 1.2, or AC 1.1 and 1.2. And then when I talk about some of the activities or how I'm going to discuss some of these topics, then I would say, I might start off with a bit of a starter activity in the session by maybe pairing up one or two learners together to say, okay, could you identify a difference? But could you start identifying the terms lesson plan and schema work? And then I would say, okay, as in pairs, if there were 3 or 4 students, I would say in pairs, could you look at, for example, identifying different ways in which you could put this together to be able to teach and deliver in the class. And then once this has been done, if learners come up with a table, they define, okay, for lesson planning, we need to ensure what is the topic. The topic is broken down into activities. The activities would require resources, and the resources would have certain objectives. So the activities would have certain objectives. So in order to get these objectives fulfilled, and if the objectives are fulfilled, then this learning would actually happen with the learners in the classroom. So a table with 5 columns, essentially listing out some of these activities, and these activities on completion can lead to the development of these kind of skills or knowledge for the learners, would essentially help me understand, that, okay, I've prepared a lesson plan. Now, how do I relate this to the minimum core? What I would do is some part of my planning involves doing activities. These activities would involve me falling back onto ensuring that I'm able to communicate clearly what are the objectives of that activity when I put them in pairs, the end result that they have to achieve as an activity when they complete, that would inform them about, some of the literacy side of things. Now, there could be mathematical part of it in terms of, looking at numbers. In some cases, some of the activities could be number driven or numeracy driven, and it could involve some evaluation, and that would relate to that in terms of the minimum core skill. And then if you're doing this as a session on Zoom, or for example, in a classroom, then if they are using any sort of ICT equipment, that would inform or relate to digital skills. They being able to say, for example, you have said at the end of it, you need to prepare a couple of slides, and those slides would then need to be presented. Now, if that is the activity, that would mean the learner would need to sit down and obviously prepare a presentation at the end of the activity, and that would be the using of the ICT skills or embedding the core of digital skills into the activity for the learners. And then last but not the least, when they look at presenting, obviously you give equal opportunity to learners to be able to present their topic well. It's not that the first group gets 10 minutes, the second gets 5 minutes, the third gets 2 minutes because the class time is that much, or, they've spent more time in planning rather than being able to have sufficient time for delivery. So that is where what you're ensuring is, okay, we'll have group 1 and 2 present today, keeping in mind that we have, about 15 minutes before the end of the class. Group 3 and 4 need to save their notes. And what we are going to do is when we start the next class, they are going to present, and they would be given equal time to be able to present what they have done and completed as a part of their work for that activity. And that would, classically show that how you're embedding, say, for example, the minimum core in the activity that you're, planned, or for the session that you planned with the learners. So this would allow you to demonstrate with an example that what would be the minimum expectations that the learners need to fulfill. And in this term, in this context, the presentation of it at some stage, when they do it either as a group work or as a presentation, or using whatever they have created, table, graph, or say, for example, a mind map and whatever it is, they would present, and that would help you to assess, at some stage, their understanding of what activity was given and whether the activity was performed to the standard which was required. And that assessment and feedback, the feedback that you would give would actually conform to the assessment in terms of how the learners have done overall on that activity. Is that okay?
Yep.
So here, a practical aspect of it is that we are able to show by example and apply the theoretical part, by explaining what you normally do in terms of planning and, let's say in most cases, planning of your sessions or lessons. And that is what at some stage in assessment criteria 2 needs to be shown as how would you apply this to a practical, situation within the class.
Can I just ask, so you've talked about obviously giving an example in the form of a table. So in terms of how I'm going to do that, so would I basically have my my lesson plan and then basically break that down into planning, delivering, assessing, and then basically the core elements, which is obviously the literacy, the numeracy, and the IT, and how I do that. So literally just do a table of showing how I plan, deliver, and assess in those three areas, which is the core elements.
I would say yes. So if I were to do this as an example by looking at following that minimum course, so the first part in terms of planning to teach, assuming I give some heading here, and I use one of the minimum, say one standard of the core, which is say planning, A1 side of things, right? So what I would do is I put the standard here. So this would be standard. Okay, and then what I would be expected to do as a teacher. So what is, say a teacher should do. And then here is where you would show the, I would say the activity that you are carrying out in the class. And then here is where I would say, if you just list it down into, say, English, maths,
ICT.
depending on if whatever skills you're using, you might not be using all the skills. So I would say basically say if I'm not using maths, I'll put EDI, or I'll just say digital skills. If I'm only using one, then probably leave that blank and just concentrate on that skill. Now that is where what you're going to do is maybe put some details down. This would come essentially from your lesson plan. This would I would say come from the lesson plan. Now, even in the lesson plan, you have lots of activities and you have lots of things that you're planning to do for a session, but you'll have to pick out just one out of them. So in this case, it says planning and looking for information about how technology can best support your planning. So in this case, what I would do is basically look at from my lesson plan point of view, what are the digital resources that I've used. So I'm going to put a blank here, and I'm going to mostly talk about the digital resources that I'm going to use in terms of planning for that particular activity that I'm going to do. So here, for example, I'm going to say teach students how to research on the internet for a particular HRM model and its application to organizations in organization real world. So
I'm basically looking at one of my lessons, and then obviously how I've applied some of those aspects.
Correct.
Okay.
So minimum
core standards. Yeah,
core standards. So I might just pick out one particular standard and then in this case basically apply. So I would basically look at, talking about, so the activity here would be, say, for example, let's look at online search strategies. That is just one example. So essentially for them to be able to start looking at research, what I would like to do is teach them how to do a bit of online research. And then I would need to make them aware of the research types.
Are you adding that to your slide? Because I'm
adding it to a slide. I'll update it.
So, because I haven't got that in front of me.
So here what I will do is basically different research methods. And these different research methods are going to be, primary, secondary, and tertiary. And then assuming in this case, I'm not looking at much more, the activity or the more core skill does not have much focus on English and EDI, but it's predominantly on digital skills. So it is basically looking at, what kind of digital skills. So I'm looking at obviously the use of internet, PC, and say, for example, I would say any other educational resources, which could be books in the library.
Can I just ask? So quite often, well, at the end of like a topic. So as I said, this term we've been looking at kind of well-being. So
Mhm.
at the end of that, I plan to do like a quiz. So would that kind of incorporate literacy in there? Because obviously they're reading, they're
Yes,
doing the quiz, and then obviously sometimes I use video, so that would obviously be incorporating ICT, wouldn't it? Digital skills.
that is correct.
Okay.
So depending on what topic that you're teaching, what you're picking up one lesson plan,
Yeah.
within that lesson plan, also breaking it down because we don't want the full lesson plan or coverage to be there. So what you're looking at doing is within that, particularly picking up one activity or one particular topic and then just detailing it out and then explaining it as verbatim under the table. That would be essentially showing that how you're applying the minimum core skills or standards for planning, delivering, and assessing, a particular lesson plan or a particular activity from a lesson.
And then that would cover learning objective. Was it 7.1 or 7.2? That
7.2, because you're applying here. So this is applying minimum core standard, and this is showing 7.2. The
so
7.1
so
is
the
more about, talking about it theoretically in terms
okay.
of how you would go about planning it. In
So
7.2, you are applying it. In 7.1, you are theoretically planning it.
so 7.2 having a table like that,
Yeah.
that would cover that assessment criteria.
Yes.
Okay.
Good stuff. So what we'll do is